Okay, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1845 to 1900. That makes him a 19th century philosopher, considered by many to be one of the precursors of modern existentialism, along with Kierkegaard. And even though this is still pretty far back in our history, Nietzsche continues to attract attention and interest in the contemporary world. If I go to a bookstore somewhere, it's hard to find a lot of books, but it's not hard to find books on Nietzsche. So his popularity persists. In part, that has to do with his style of writing. So he had a unique style, what has been described as a kind of aphoristic style. He didn't write long essays, but rather short passages on topics to develop his ideas. So he's very approachable, although that doesn't mean he's easy to understand. And he's also still relevant because of the content of what he had to say. So it still resonates with contemporary thinkers and contemporary people in general. After Kant, and especially after Hegel, philosophy had to move in new directions. It wasn't as though the philosophy of Kant and the philosophy of Hegel had failed. You know, they were both sort of monuments of rationalistic philosophy. Hegel's was a speculative, metaphysical marvel in a way, but it was kind of as though this kind of philosophy, the rationalistic based philosophy, had exhausted itself, and it was time for some new approach to appear in the field of philosophy. Generally, any approach that tried to build a system was viewed with suspicion. Any approach that claimed to have all the answers or claimed that to have everything figured out was rejected, or, as I said, at least viewed with suspicion. So going forward, philosophy took two pretty different directions. And the first was, you could say, philosophy viewed as a science. The second one is going to be philosophy viewed as art. See, these are very dramatically opposed to each other. Philosophy as science tried to become even more scientific than previously. I mean, in terms of its approach to doing philosophy. So strict logic, and strict adherence to scientific methodologies were employed. I think the earliest example of this kind of philosophy was logical positivism. Philosophy as science became popular and dominated the scene in Great Britain, and also in the United States, in the Americas. Philosophy as an art kind of didn't trust scientific methodology to deal with philosophical topics. So instead, there was a lot more room given to the imagination and human creativity in the practice of this kind of philosophy. The earliest movement, I think, in this field was existentialism. And this type of philosophy was popular in Europe, in particular in France and also in Germany. We could say it's in this second kind of philosophy as art that Nietzsche enters the scene. We could make a list of some of the themes to start with that run through Nietzsche's work. First of all, and maybe one of the most important, is his rejection of the traditional emphasis on rationality. In his view, all that emphasis on rationality went all the way back to Socrates and Plato. And in his view, that's when philosophy went astray. Nietzsche felt that the pre-Socratics had been closer to a more holistic sort of approach to philosophy than the approach that Socrates and Plato and subsequent philosophers would take in their emphasis on trying to be reasonable in all areas of human life. And so the flip side of this rejection of traditional philosophy meant that there was, for Nietzsche, a greater recognition of the irrational side of life for human beings. We could say this is in the world of, psychologically speaking, the subconsciousness, with human passions and emotions included in the overall picture. So this depth dimension for human beings had to be included, and it was kind of an illusion to think that somehow the rational part of a human being should be the part that is in control of a human being, which is what the traditional views seem to be. Secondly, it's not a new idea, but the relativity of all truths is an idea that Nietzsche embraced. There didn't believe that there were any objective truths that we could rely on, or there weren't any external standards of truth that we could use to measure what's true and what isn't true. Any measure independent of ourselves as human beings. So human beings decide what the truth is, and it differs for different humans, differs in different times, and so on. The real danger with respect to the truth, or the relativity of truth, was the possibility of reaching a point where you would not believe in any truth at all. So that would be the threat of nihilism. Nietzsche was aware of this threat, and sometimes people say that Nietzsche was a nihilist, but I don't think that fits his perspective on things too well. But he saw the dangers of what nihilism might bring if it wasn't checked. The third theme, you could say, is the inclusion of the historical in Nietzsche's thought. History was a major element in the philosophy of Hegel, and although a lot of Hegel's philosophy was to be left behind, but his emphasis on the development of history was something that is still with us in the modern world. So Nietzsche was one of the first ones to kind of recognize that the ideas that we have and the values that we have are the result of historical developments, that they weren't once and for all, but whatever it was that we believed, the ideas that we believed in, the values that we believed in, that they were what they were as a result of certain historical developments. So there's a kind of relativity in terms of truth about ideas and values involved in that. So depending on the time and the history and so forth. And even, which meant that for Nietzsche to do research into where a particular idea came from or where a particular value came from, you might have to do a kind of genealogical sort of study in order to reveal it. The fourth point here is almost goes without saying that for Nietzsche there's a definite rejection of religion. And for him, that meant rejection of Christianity, which was the dominant religion in his time and in his place. And a rejection especially of the idea that religion might still provide a kind of, people use the term moral compass for people, that you could still use religion as a kind of guide to help you live your life. Nietzsche famously or infamously sort of announced that God is dead. He thought that was obvious, although it was still not known to most people. And especially it wasn't the consequences if it was true that God was dead, and it didn't mean God had actually died. It just meant that religion no longer could fulfill the role in the life of human beings that it had in the past. So in a sense, God had died. And or in a sense, we'd reached a point in our intellectual development where it was no longer tenable to believe in God or the basic beliefs of established religion. So that was no longer anything that human beings could rely on. The fifth point here, I've already mentioned a little bit, was an appreciation for kind of psychological analysis in terms of the study of ideas and the study of human beings. It couldn't just be, you had to dig beneath the surface to try and understand what was taking place on the surface. So here again, you could say, and this was in an age, this is the age of Freud and kind of the birth of psychology, and Nietzsche, like others, sort of drew from this new way of thinking in order to explain things. So he would explain a lot of the things that took place in the life of human beings with kind of psychological explanation. This would be a big part of the existentialist traditions, existentialist philosophy, as it would emerge as well. And again, it's sort of a recognition of the influence of the subconscious in the world of the conscious for human beings. A big role in Nietzsche's philosophy was played by his will to power, which for him was the fundamental drive that functioned deep within human beings. And the will to power is kind of behind every human activity in his view. So as a kind of fundamental drive beyond a place where we could consciously have any control over it. Finally, I already mentioned imagination and creativity. These were accepted and given a place of prominence in Nietzsche's philosophy. The aim for Nietzsche was that truth wasn't something that you would discover. It's not like it's out there and you can find it, but instead the truth is something that has to be created for oneself. So this sense of self-creation, creativity through the end use of the imagination both have important roles to play in trying to live a good life. Well, we can see how a number of these themes become combined and intertwined if we try to analyze two of Nietzsche's most crucial distinctions. And that's going to be the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and his analysis of master and slave morality as well. One of Nietzsche's earliest works was titled The Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music, in which he introduced these two terms, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. These were, in his presentation, were two different artistic or creative impulses within us as human beings. And the inspiration for them was drawn from the ancient Greeks, from two Greek gods in Greek mythology, Apollo and Dionysius. Apollo was viewed as the inspiration that provided form to an artwork, or it provided balance or proportion in a way. So the Apollonian established limits and set limits to things, and he's given this side of things. The term is used, the principle of individuation. This means that who we are as individuals is only established when we set limits between ourselves and others, so that we can kind of identify who we are as distinct from other people and so forth. So it's the Apollonian that gives us the basis for individuation. The best example of this kind of art form that Nietzsche appeals to was early Greek sculpture. And you can say that Apollo is also well known as representing the rational, all this idea of form, balance, proportion, and so forth, ideal beauty of Greek sculpture and so forth, comes from, is associated with the Apollonian in terms of creativity within ourselves. The other artistic impulse he refers to as Dionysian, and Dionysius is you could say Dionysius is what provides the inspiration for an artwork, or it's what energizes it, provides the energy. And this energy comes through being connected with the primal life force within oneself. In this energy is related to the passions and the emotions that we feel. I mean, so much more energy in passions and the emotions than there are in rational thought. Powerful energy, but also can be chaotic and also can be destructive. He gives this example that the Dionysian is, if Apollo provides the principle of individuation, you could say the Dionysian removes the limits, as in intoxication or drunkenness. You say when one's inhibitions or the limits, fall away. And in a sense, one loses oneself. And as a result of losing oneself, one becomes connected with the primal life force which is in everybody, or in us, just as insofar as we're human beings, but not as individuals. And this kind of experience of ecstasy, I'm going to say ecstasy literally, this ecstasis, say that's standing outside of oneself. So the Dionysian is this kind of liberating, freeing sort of oneself from all kinds of limitations. The Apollo imposes limits. These two artistic forces are both going to be viewed as necessary for the creation of a work of art for Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the Greeks found a way to combine these two creative impulses when they created Greek tragedy. As he saw it, this art form really made it possible for the Greeks to accept their true natures and yet not be destroyed by that knowledge, but enable them to rise above the destructive impulses within themselves. You consider the example that he refers to as the story of Oedipus, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, as an example of a Greek tragedy where the fate of Oedipus is a tragic fate, and there's something about the story itself, about the tragedy, which doesn't depress people when they hear it, but somehow it purges them, I think is the term Aristotle. Kind of catharsis, kind of purification of negative emotions is enabled by being part of, being present, at a performance of one of these ancient Greek tragedies. So this, in general, I'm just going to say, if you compare it or encounter contradistinction with contemporary sentimentality which can't accept a Dionysian element within itself, or if you say that if the Dionysian element is kind of the dark side within, to use a Star Wars phrase, always seeks to exclude it in favor of the rational Apollonian. So Nietzsche thinks that that's a problem for us as moderns, is that we don't have an art form which enables us to recognize, or to include that we have a dark side within ourselves as well as a light side. So that's one of the things he would like to help establish. I just included this image because I like images. And this one is an image, I think it's taken from a Grecian urn or a piece of pottery in some form. And I think that accounts for some of the distortion we see in the picture. But it's supposed to represent, on the left is Apollo with his bow and arrow. In the center here, I think this is a goddess, Leto. And on the right is a figure who's called Titios. And I think Titios is kind of a stand-in for Dionysius, so Apollo's killing Titios to protect Leto from Titios. And then I think the rest of the mythology is that Titios undergoes all kinds of horrible punishments in the underworld, which kind of corresponds with the suffering associated with Dionysius. So it's interesting to have some image to appeal to. I don't know whether it helps too much, but I included it anyway. Also found this quote which describes the experience of a spectator to one of the Greek tragedies during that time, and kind of contrast it with the point of view of more contemporary people. I'll just read this. The Greek spectators, by looking into the abyss of human suffering and affirming it, passionately and joyously affirmed the meaning of their own existence. They knew themselves to be infinitely more than petty individuals, finding self-affirmation not in another life, not in a world to come, but in the terror and ecstasy alike celebrated in the performance of the tragedies. So here, this is supposed to explain the purifying effect of the Greek tragedies had on people, that enabled them to look into the abyss of human suffering and nonetheless sort of embracing that and including it and overcoming it. The second distinction in Nietzsche that I wanted to comment on is the distinction between master and slave morality. A couple of introductory comments before we start to look in detail at these two. First of all, is the historic nature of it. And you could say this is one of those genealogies, or it's historically or genealogically. Nietzsche's arguing that different kinds of moralities originated or came into existence from different socio-economic situations back in some historical time period. So what he's giving us is a kind of genealogy of morals. Where did morals come from in the first place? And the analysis here is not that one kind of morality is more true or better than the other, but that they're just different. It's kind of like a logical result of what we are as human beings. We have a kind of nature. We're made a certain way. You put us in certain kinds of situations, and if the situations are different, you might see that different sets of values will emerge from ourselves in those different situations. So this is, and he's talking basically about socio-economic or differences in terms of inequities in terms of power in social and economic situations. And so you get different sets of values from people who are put into different situations and different attitudes toward the life that they end up living anyway. So that's one part of it. There's kind of historical analysis of where moralities originate from and sort of what the socio and economic and power bases were in those historical situations. Also, there's a psychological dimension to this analysis. We could say we mentioned the will to power before, and the will to power in this analysis is ever present. It's like a constant, and it's the primal human drive, and the values we embrace are a result of how this drive gets expressed for us, or how we're able to express this will to power in our life, depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Master morality. Masters were able to freely express their will to power in the external world. Masters did whatever they wanted. They were in control, and for them, life was good. Because of this, masters had a positive attitude towards life. They affirmed it. They said yes to it. Nietzsche uses this expression, yea saying. For Nietzsche, the prominent examples of this were the Romans and also barbarian peoples. In both cases, these were peoples who were in control of their own destinies, and they affirmed their existence in their relationships with the external world. They didn't have much need for reflection or for turning inward. Their values included nobility, pride, aggression, self-assertion, domination, etc. Nietzsche clearly thought that this morality was a more natural expression of who we are as human beings. Slave morality. We could say that slaves were unable to freely express their will to power in the external world. Just like the masters, slaves were governed by within the will to power. Except slaves were not in control of their destiny. They couldn't do whatever they wanted to do, and hence their will to power from an external point of view was frustrated, and they resented it. Instead, the only way, but still the will to power wishes to express itself, so the slave turns to the only place he can where his will to power can manifest itself, and that's to turn inward on himself. So the slaves will turn inward. You could say that this ends up being a turn to the inner world, to the spiritual world. And it's motivated by a wish for power, and it's also the values that end up coming out of this term were a wish for help in the situation, in the powerless situation they found themselves in externally. So for Nietzsche, the best examples of slaves and the kind of morality that emerged out of a slave situation were the Jews and early Christians. So in order to persist, the slaves denied the external values of the masters, but instead affirmed internal values, the ones that helped them deal with reality. You say, the ones that were kind of asking for help: human kindness, compassion, sympathy, sharing. All of these were good for the slaves, but bad for the masters. And what was good for the masters would be bad for the slaves. So it worked in both directions. But you get just the opposite kind of morality based on the different situations that people found themselves in historically. So it accounts for two different kinds of morality that Nietzsche's going to call master morality and slave morality. As Nietzsche saw it, what was good for the slaves was really a denial of what was most natural for human beings. And for him, it seemed like the slaves were saying no to life, no to the external expression of life. So the slave morality was naysaying to life. Master morality was yea saying, affirmed life as it was. It wasn't that slave morality was wrong. I mean, it was clearly a legitimate expression of the will to power in the slave situation. What else were the slaves supposed to do? So I think Nietzsche would acknowledge that. But what bothered Nietzsche about this morality was that as history progressed, slave morality, which became the basic morality of Christianity, won out and became the dominant morality in Western civilized countries. This meant that what was considered good by the slaves, by Christians, came to be considered good, period. And what was considered good for the masters would eventually come to be considered as evil, period. No question about it. So it was a kind of rejection, the success story of Christianity and the morality that came along with Christianity, which, as Nietzsche saw it, was a slave morality, became dominant and kind of negated everything that master morality had embraced and thought of as good. Nietzsche hated this development and was vehemently opposed to it. And when Nietzsche was vehemently opposed to something, he could be very acerbic, acidic in his comments. He had a talent for expressing things poetically and oftentimes in a kind of exaggerated fashion in order to make his point, because usually he was making points that ran against the grain of the society within which he lived, and would still be going against the grain even in contemporary society. As he saw it, slave morality in the form of Christianity turned morality upside down, so much so that the lowly values of the herd came to be considered as the norm, and the higher values of the master came to be viewed negatively, considered evil. To aspire to greatness as an individual was thought to be negative. It was thought to be evil. And this is really what Nietzsche is all about, that one should aspire, reach for a star, aspire to be great. To be like everybody else, to be mediocre, basically, was good from the slave morality point of view. I think it's maybe a little risky, but it's tempting, and I think it's legitimate to link master morality with the Dionysian elements within ourselves. That's what came to be viewed as bad, be viewed as evil. Master morality and the dark side within ourselves came to be viewed negatively. And for Nietzsche, these were elements that were crucial to our nature as human beings, and kind of an extremely important part of our nature. Slave morality, on the other hand, becomes linked to the Apollonian and becomes viewed as good. So, and that includes the love of the common man, the herd, the love of democracy, and the love of socialism, and so forth. All of these were irrational trends, and sort of kind of denied the more dynamic aspects of our nature represented by the Dionysian. Well, Nietzsche railed against those developments, and basically he called for a revaluation of all values. In other words, a rethinking of the question of morality. When he made the claim that God is dead, and one of the consequences of that, if that meant the end of Christianity, it also should have meant the end of the morality associated with Christianity, because then there was no longer any foundation for it. So this revaluation of all values would have included a revaluation, and at least that's what he was calling for, or wished would take place, as people rethink the questions of morality, trying to understand where our morals came from, what they represented within ourselves. Basically, I think in the end, you would say that what Nietzsche was advocating, and what he spoke about on many occasions, was a kind of self-overcoming for each of us as human beings. So, to reach for a star, I think I said, or to strive to be for greatness and so forth. This is advocated kind of self-overcoming and a kind of rising above oneself, ultimately to become an overman. And that's sometimes, it's Ubermensch, sometimes translated as Superman, Overman. And he uses this phrase that we're human, all too human, and in a way it means what we are is unfinished, and that we need to rise above ourselves the way we find ourselves, to make something great of ourselves. And to do that, we have to create ourselves as though we were a work of art. So creatively and imaginatively, and accepting whatever difficulty and suffering and hardship is involved in that enterprise as part of the process. This was his answer to the threat of nihilism, that if we don't rise above ourselves, then it looks like nihilism and pessimism are kind of inevitable. So there's a call to everyone to rise above the herd, become more than what one is. He uses this expression, which is kind of shocking, that one should become a Caesar with the soul of a Christ. That means to live in both worlds. Caesar in the external world, Christ in the internal world. You see, Nietzsche would have had to admit that even in the slave morality, that this turn within upon oneself that opens up the spiritual world is a significant movement in the history of human beings. It opens up a whole new realm that he would have appreciated. It was just he didn't want to see the inner world emphasized at the expense of the outer world. He had to live in both worlds. And we should have the best of both worlds, to be a master in both cases, and the outer and the inner.